I never thought much about age gaps before. When I was younger, I imagined myself as the kind of mother who would be young enough to keep up, to understand, to move in step with my child. But life has a way of unfolding in ways we don't always predict. I had my son, Daniel, when I was 28. I was old enough to feel steady, young enough to feel strong. And now, at 46, I still feel young in so many ways, though the world likes to remind me otherwise. Daniel at 18 is in that stage where he's half a man, half a boy. He carries himself with a quiet sort of confidence, but I can see it. Those moments of hesitation, the way his hands fidget in his pockets when someone pays him a compliment. He doesn't fully see himself yet. But I also see something else. Lately, I've noticed the way Daniel interacts with me is different. Not just the usual growing up distance, but something else. Something quieter, more uncertain. He seems unsure around me, watching his words, avoiding my gaze at times. It makes me wonder, does he think I'm old? Do I embarrass him? I didn't want that. I didn't want to become the mother that a son outgrows before I'm ready to let go. So I decided to make some changes. Small things at first. Updating my wardrobe, paying a little more attention to my hair, finding time for exercise. I started taking better care of myself, not just for him but for me. And slowly, I noticed the way he watched me shift. The first time he commented, it was casual. "You're dressing different," he said one evening as I made dinner. He leaned against the counter, his fingers drumming against the surface. "You think so?" asked, keeping my tone light. I shrugged. "Yeah, it looks nice. Just different." I smiled, turning back to the stove, but inside something flickered. After that, I became more aware of things. The way Daniel's eyes lingered sometimes when I walked past, the way he seemed to hesitate before speaking, as though measuring his words. There was an uncertainty in him I hadn't seen before, and it fascinated me. One evening after a long day, we sat in the living room together. The house was quiet, the air thick with the smell of the rain outside. He was scrolling through his phone, half paying attention to the TV. "Do you think I should have had you younger?" asked, my voice soft, casual. He looked up, frowning slightly. "What?" "Some people say it's better. That parents should be younger, closer in age, so they can keep up with their kids." Daniel was quiet for a moment, as if considering. Then he shook his head. "I don't think it would have made a difference," he said. "You've always been you." Something about the way he said it made my heart tighten. A few weeks later, I suggested we go hiking together, something we hadn't done in years. He seemed surprised but agreed, and early that Saturday morning, we set out on the familiar trails near our home. The air was crisp, the trees thick and green, stretching up into a sky that promised warmth despite the early chill. Daniel walked ahead of me at first, his long strides confident, but he kept glancing back, waiting for me. Eventually we fell into step beside each other. "You're keeping up better than I thought you would," he teased, grinning. I nudged his shoulder. "That's because I'm not old, no matter what you think." He laughed, shaking his head. "I never said that." "No, but you thought it." For a moment he didn't respond. Then, in a quieter voice, he said, "I just don't think of you like, I don't know, like other moms." I turned to him, arching an eyebrow. "And what does that mean?" He hesitated, then shook his head. "Nothing. Just that you're different." I smiled, letting the silence stretch between us. As we climbed higher, the conversation shifted, becoming easier, lighter. By the time we reached the overlook, I felt like we had found something we had been slowly losing, something I didn't want to let go of. We stood there together, staring out over the valley below. The sun was warm on my skin, and beside me, Daniel exhaled deeply. "It's nice up here," he murmured. He nodded. "Yeah." For a long moment we just stood there. Then he turned to me, his expression unreadable. "You're happy, right?" The question caught me off guard. "Of course," I said automatically. Daniel frowned, looking away. "I mean, really happy." I hesitated. Was I? I had spent so many years focused on him, on raising him, on being the kind of mother he needed. And now that he was grown, stepping into his own life, I wasn't sure what was left for me. I think I'm still figuring that out, I admitted. Daniel nodded slowly, then reached out, squeezing my hand. And in that moment I realized, whatever changed, however our relationship evolved, I would always be his mother. But maybe, just maybe, we were stepping into something new. Something different. And I wasn't afraid of it anymore. We sat down on the wooden bench, the valley stretching endlessly before us. The sun had started its slow descent, casting a golden hue over the hills, turning the trees into silhouettes against the sky. The wind was gentle, barely rustling the leaves, as if the world itself had paused, waiting. Daniel sat beside me, his hands clasped loosely together, elbows resting on his knees. His posture was relaxed, but something about the way he exhaled, slow, measured, told me he had something on his mind. I watched him out of the corner of my eye, waiting. Then he finally spoke. "You know," he started, his voice lower than usual, "I heard what you said before, about having me younger. But that's never been the reason I've been distant." I turned to him, surprised by his words. "No." He shook his head, a small, almost bitter smile on his lips. "It's not the age difference. It's not that at all." I frowned slightly, tilting my head. "Then what is it?" Daniel took a deep breath and leaned back against the bench, his hands still fidgeting in his lap. He was looking straight ahead, as if he couldn't quite bring himself to meet my eyes. "It's because I like you," he said finally. "On the contrary." For a moment I thought I had misheard him. The wind whispered between us, carrying his words away as if they were too fragile to linger in the air. I sat still, processing. He likes me. Not as a mother. Not in the way a son is supposed to like his mother. I opened my mouth to say something, but no words came out. I wasn't even sure what I wanted to say. A denial. A reassurance. Question. Daniel must have mistaken my silence for discomfort because he let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. "Forget it," he muttered, rubbing a hand over his face. "I shouldn't have said anything." I finally found my voice, though it was softer than I intended. "Daniel." He didn't look at me, his fingers gripping the edge of the bench. "It's been messing with me for a while now," he admitted. "I thought maybe it was just in my head. Just something stupid I could ignore. But the more time we spend together, the more I notice things. The way you carry yourself, the way you laugh, the way you see me. And it scares the hell out of me." His confession hung between us, raw and unfiltered. For a moment I let myself feel the weight of it, the way it settled deep into my chest. "I don't know what to say," I admitted, my own voice barely above a whisper. Daniel exhaled, shaking his head. "You don't have to say anything. I needed you to know." We sat there in silence, the world moving around us, yet we remained frozen in this moment that neither of us had expected. And yet, despite everything, I wasn't repulsed. I wasn't afraid. If anything, I felt a strange sense of relief. Because now, the unspoken thing that had been lingering between us had finally been said. The ride home was quiet. Daniel kept his eyes on the road, his grip firm on the steering wheel. I watched him, taking in the way his jaw tensed, the way his fingers drummed absent-mindedly against the leather. I wanted to say something. To tell him that I wasn't angry, that I didn't hate him, but I didn't know how. Instead, I reached over and placed my hand over his, stopping his nervous tapping. His breath hitched, but he didn't pull away. When we finally pulled into the driveway, we sat in the car for a few moments, neither of us making a move to get out. Finally, Daniel spoke, his voice hesitant. "Are we okay?" I swallowed. "Yes, we're okay." He nodded, but I could see the uncertainty still lingering in his expression. As we stepped into the house, the air felt different. Heavy, charged, but not in a way that made me want to run. In a way that made me want to understand. In the days that followed, something between us shifted. Daniel didn't pull away anymore. He didn't avoid my eyes. If anything, he started to seek me out more. At first, it was subtle, sitting a little closer on the couch when we watched TV, brushing his hand against mine when passing the salt at dinner. But then, it became more deliberate. One evening, as I was finishing up in the kitchen, he leaned against the counter, watching me. "Can I help?" he asked. I smiled, handing him a dish towel. "You just want an excuse to stand around." He smirked but took the towel anyway, drying the plate I handed him. As we worked side by side, I felt the warmth of him close to me, the quiet comfort of his presence. At one point our hands brushed. I didn't pull away. Neither did he. He let out a quiet breath, tilting his head slightly. "You don't hate me for what I said, do you?" I set the last dish on the rack and turned to face him. "No," I said honestly. His gaze searched mine. "Then what do you feel?" I hesitated. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "But I know I don't want you to be afraid of me." He let out a shaky laugh. "Afraid of you? Never." I reached up, brushing his hair out of his face like I had done when he was a boy. But this time the way he looked at me was different. And I knew, without a doubt, that things would never be the same. I didn't know where this was going. I didn't know what it meant. But for the first time in a long time, I wasn't afraid to find out. The night after our hike, we sat in the dim glow of the living room, the hum of the television playing in the background. Daniel was beside me on the couch. His presence warm, familiar. Yet, there was something different in the air. Something softer, unspoken, waiting to be acknowledged. He shifted slightly, glancing at me before speaking. "Can I ask you something?" His voice was careful, uncertain. I turned to him, my body angled toward his. "Of course." Daniel hesitated, his fingers fidgeting against his thigh. "Did you love him?" It took me a moment to realize what he meant. His father. The man I had spent years with. The man who had once been my partner but had never truly been my peace. I let out a slow breath, my gaze falling to my hands in my lap. "No," I admitted, my voice steady but quiet. "I didn't love him." Daniel's brows furrowed slightly, his lips parting as if to ask more. I exhaled again, gathering my thoughts before continuing. "I wanted to in the beginning," I said, my fingers tracing the hem of my sleeve. "But he wasn't a good man to me. He insulted me a lot. Made me feel small when I wasn't. He never really saw me." Daniel's jaw clenched. His hands, which had been relaxed, curled into loose fists. "I always wondered," he murmured. "I used to hear him sometimes. The way he spoke to you." I turned to him, surprised. "You did?" Daniel gave a slow nod, his expression darkening. "Yeah. And I hated it." His voice was lower now, rough with something unspoken. "I hated the way he treated you." I reached out, resting a hand on his arm. "It wasn't your burden to carry, sweetheart." Daniel finally met my gaze, his eyes burning with something fierce, something protective. "But I carried it anyway," he said. I never understood why you stayed." A sad smile touched my lips. "Because back then I thought I had to." Silence stretched between us, heavy yet filled with understanding. Then I said it, the words that had been sitting on my tongue, waiting. "But I love you, Daniel." His breath caught. I saw it happen, the way his entire body tensed, then softened all at once, as if my words had unraveled something deep inside him. For a moment he didn't speak. He just stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he exhaled, his lips parting slightly as if he were tasting the moment, trying to make sense of it. And then I saw it. That quiet happiness, the kind that didn't need words. His shoulders relaxed, his grip on his knee loosening. His eyes softened in a way I had never seen before. He was happy, so silently, beautifully happy. As if those words, my words, were the only thing he had ever wanted to hear. As if he had been waiting for them. From that night on, something shifted between us. Daniel became more tender, more thoughtful. He watched me, closely, carefully, in ways he never had before. First, it was subtle. The way he lingered when we spoke, as if memorizing every word. The way his hand would brush against mine in passing, hesitant yet deliberate. Then it became more obvious. One evening I was cooking dinner, humming softly to myself, when I felt a presence behind me. Daniel. He stepped closer, reaching past me to grab a glass from the cabinet, but his movements were slow, intentional. His chest nearly brushed my back, his breath warm against my shoulder. I stilled, suddenly hyper-aware of how close he was. Then, as if sensing my pause, he leaned in just slightly. "You look happy," he murmured, his voice low, intimate. I turned my head, catching his gaze. "I think I am." His lips twitched into the faintest smile. "Good." And then, just as effortlessly as he had appeared, he stepped away. But the air still buzzed with his presence. Daniel had always been caring, but now it was different. He wanted to give me everything. Not just in gestures but in presence, in patience. He was always there, making sure I never had to reach too far for anything. When I sat down to read in the evenings, he would bring me a cup of tea without me asking. When we watched movies together, he would pull the blanket over my legs before I even noticed I was cold. When I walked into a room, his eyes would find me, always watching. Not in a way that was imposing, but in a way that felt like he simply needed to know I was there. Like he found comfort in my presence. Like I was his world. And in a way maybe I was. One night, as we sat together in the quiet of the house, Daniel turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Can I do something?" he asked. I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached out, hesitating just slightly, before tucking a loose strand of hair behind my ear. His fingers were warm, slow, lingering for just a moment longer than they needed to. His touch sent something through me, something I couldn't name. I exhaled, my heart beating just a little too fast. "Daniel," I started, unsure of what I wanted to say. But he just smiled, softly, knowingly. "I just wanted to see you better," he murmured. And for the first time I realized. He saw me, not just as a mother, not just as someone who had raised him, but as a woman. And in his eyes, I saw something I had never seen before. Devotion. Not out of duty, but out of love. Real unwavering love. And for the first time in a long time I let myself feel it. Let myself embrace the warmth of his presence, the way his hand still hovered near my face, as if he were afraid to pull away too soon. Because for the first time, I wasn't afraid. I wasn't alone. I was loved. And in that moment that was all that mattered.